No Silva, I'm Stephen Sexton with the family.
Nick Burkini, Vice Chair, Merced Subbasin GSA.
Gino Pedretti, Merced GSA, board member from San Diego Coastal Water Guard. Bob DeValley, board member.
Lou Myers, Brewer on the east side.
Greg Young was Zanhero, consultant to the GSA. And was anybody online, were you able to hear around the room, or is it just the microphone closest to those of us logged in?
It's good.
Okay, awesome. It's a new location, so we're not sure how everything's picking up, so.
And this is Ashley Chen Gonzalez from the Merced Subbasin GSA.
And then can you read the names of online?
Yeah, so the people that we have online, we have Adam, we have Adriel Ramirez, Ben Crane, Betty Lindeman, Katie, Danielle, David, Ellen just joined, Eric, Irojasti, Kevin, Letty, we have Merkeen Water District, Mike Gallo, Natalie, Nav, Robert, Sebastian, Shane, Zach, and then a telephone number.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Greg, let's get right to it. It's the first question is, how do we want to, is there an interest to how to go through this document? Sorry, you just shared you. I gotta change my screen again.
Yeah.
I was trying to make sure. So we have, what was put online were two versions dated August 12th. One was a red line and one was a clean version accepting all those red lines. That version was requested by the board to be posted following the last board meeting and be held as it is with this workshop and with comments being submitted up until about noon on the 2nd, with the intent of a final version to be prepared and made available by Friday that week. I think that's what we're shooting for, which would be the 5th. So that the board meeting on the 12th would have that updated version. So what we have right now is a red line version. And maybe we can work from that and talk through any particular comments. We have received some comments submitted already. There's been some other conversations, but nothing is being changed to the versions that are available online, and nothing will be changed to them until after the 2nd. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay.
The second being what?
So
Significance.
the second, we set that as a close of comments. So once we get comments, then we can look, because your comment may be completely different than Dave's comment. I guess probably not, but you guys have two conflicting comments. We're going to need to resolve and figure out what we're accepting and what we're not, and how we're addressing it, and have some conversation probably with the ad hoc board committee, and then publish a final clean and red line on the roughly the 5th. And that red line will be off of the current clean version of the 12th. Does that clarify, Bob? So we can go through this document section by section and look at where all the changes were and talk about those changes. If that seems to make, is that the will of the group? On page 1, you can, again, working from the 812 red line version. It is the version you're sharing, right, Ashley? If you scroll down towards the bottom are the first set of red lines. And we are just clarifying a few things here to make sure people understand that what this allocation is related to extraction of water for agricultural purposes, regardless of the classification, because there are some places where the classifications don't necessarily match what you would think is traditional irrigated ag, but yet more traditional irrigated ag is happening. We also wanted to clarify because of some conversations with the assessor's office, that we are using their information to initiate our accounts and what classifies as already opted in or could get opted in under these different discussions and these rules. So the assessor's office has these designations that are part of the definitions under 1.3 of irrigated, grazing, and managed wetland, and in several land use codes. We have had a fair number of inquiries about those land use codes and people asking about, well, where are they? What are they? And are you able to see the website?
Yeah, I can pull it up.
We were pretty much understanding that all that was public, but not realizing it was not as available to all the parcel owners as we would have thought. And we realized that there was some questions and people didn't know what their codes were and things were unknown. So we did, and kudos to Adriel for pointing out, there is a Merced County Agency of Government's GIS website that we now have linked to the MSGSA board homepage, right? It's on our homepage somewhere.
Yeah, it's gonna be on the homepage after the
Okay.
workshop.
It will be after the workshop, it'll be on the homepage, but this is the website. If you typed in Merced County Association of Governments GIS, you should see this. And if you scroll down a little bit, you can click on the parcel search. And through a couple of examples, we'll show the information that pops. And this is all publicly available information within Merced County. The thing this doesn't have is the sustainability zones. So, but you guys know where your parcels are that you might be investigating anyway.
What is this website?
MCAG.
So it's what you see up there is GIS-MCAGOV.OpenData, blah, blah, blah. But if you Google search Merced County Association of Governments GIS online, you should come up with this portal. We will have the link on the Merced Subbasin GSA homepage. Zoom in and click on a parcel. And regardless of whether it's in one of our zones or not, we can at least, you can see what kind of information is on here. If we click on a particular parcel, you see this set of data come up. And if you scroll down on this set of data, it actually has right there use code 808, trees or vines indicated. So those who are asking, well, what's 0909 or 1414, or what's grazing and what's dairy or poultry, or where do you guys get these designations? These are available online, publicly available, and is consistent. We are still using that to pre-populate our accounts. Going forward, if, for example, always a problem solver, Dave. Love it. If, for example, going forward, you opt in grazing land, the assessor is not going to change it grazing land, but internal to us, we will be creating an indicator that says it's grazing land, opt in 1, or some sort of definition that'll let us know that that parcel, for our purposes, has opted in, and we'll have some sort of rules associated with it.
Are the acres sometimes different with this than on APN?
This has the
That.
This has the GIS acres, which again, the county is undertaking an effort to better align the GIS and the APN tax assessor. And that's a couple-year effort, I believe, Lloyd, that they're in the middle of.
Yeah.
So those should ultimately be the same. Right now, if you looked at your tax assessed acres by APN, it might be slightly different than the GIS. And in some cases, the alignments are a little off. All of that's continued to be cleaned up. But this is our starting point. So when we talk about things of being irrigated ag, in fact, I'm going to flip everybody to a moment to page 5.
I wanted to say something about the site before
Oh,
we
yeah.
move on.
ahead.
For those of you that have parcels that don't have an address, you would want to make sure you click on this magnifying glass and then type in your parcel number. Otherwise, the find address or place is only by road names and addresses. So if you need to type in your parcel number, make sure to click on this magnifying glass to do that.
So that, yeah, that's the easy way, type in your APN, or if you know where you are on the map, zoom in and click on your parcels, you should see this information. If on page 5, you see the definition of grazing land, and we see at the bottom of that where we say presumed to be grazing land by the MSGSA, and it's got 3 code numbers, 0907, 0909, and 0911. Those different code numbers would show up in this data set when you go and search these. Further example is under irrigated agricultural lands. We see a series of codes showing up there. The one we were just looking at was trees and pines 0808, I believe.
What page?
So on page 5, irrigated lands. You see the values there, and you see the code number after trees and vines 0802, 0806, 0807. These all line up with that GIS website we were just looking at. So if people are wondering what code they have because they've never seen it on their own tax bill, or land use classification designation like trees and vines or dairy or poultry, that data set will help. We are going to try and work to integrate it in so it works with our lookup of your sustainability zone, so it can be more intersected. These are initiations. So now coming back to the top of page 2, the red line statement there is just clarifying we are using this as a starting point. We as the GSA will have a database that we're managing this information going forward. So all of this is the starting point. The assessor was getting several calls asking about what's my code, or how do I change something? And so we're trying to minimize the calls to the assessor's office and recognize that this is just a starting point. So hopefully that's clear. Then there's several red line adds under authority, which is just additional legal authority language that the GSA Council wanted to add. And so now we move to the top of page 3. And this goes to parts of definitions. What we realized in looking at some of the comments, and that maybe there was a misunderstanding of what additional pumping allowance was and what it wasn't. And so the language under 131, additional pumping allowance, and the new additional definition of alternative source 132 was to clarify that ultimately the water you are consuming on your property that we will be watching from the standpoint of your groundwater allocation is your sustainable yield of native groundwater and your additional pumping allowance, which is an element of groundwater that we're recognizing will be temporarily available. But you may also, parcel specific, have alternative sources that you are using either completely instead of either of those groundwater sources or to supplement those sources. So we identified alternative source, which shows up later under the monitoring aspect. And this is where your alternative sources could be a surface water right or a contract, a recharge water from a recharge water account, which may be generated through recognized seepage and tracking of that seepage, or other actions to create the recharge, or some other designation of a alternative source. Are there any questions about that add and that clarification of APA and this alternative source? It was what was intended, but it may have been confusing in the language before.
We have Ellen with their hand raised.
Hi there. I was just wondering, is the GSA itself going to oversee and verify recharge water accounts, or are you gonna allow for recharge water accounts to be set up through like third parties, or I'm just wondering a little bit about that.
The intent, and it's, there is later, I think it's under section 1.84, where we talk about alternative sources. The GSA will want to be tracking it, will want to approve what it's recognized as recharge. And that number is going to be an annualized number that you may put water in a year, or take water out, or put and take in the same year. And so it's kind of like any other account. It will show up in the groundwater accounting platform as a bucket. That documentation provided to the GSA will allow a number to be put there and be able to be taken from or added to. And so we'll have to be seeing that information and agreeing with it. But it likely, it will build on the framework, recharge framework that was adopted a couple years ago. I'm looking to Lloyd to see if we can remember the time exactly. So it's going to build on that, but it is not fully defined yet. Ellen, it is identified to be defined by April next year to give us.
2023 during the big winter, early 20.
Okay, that's when it was. January, February 2023, there was a framework. And it, yeah.
Get some framework.
See, I should look to Brad.
You're there.
Okay. Does that help, Ellen?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're going to be adopting some standards by which you will review and verify the recharge account is acceptable before you approve it and put it into your system. So thanks.
Yes. And I know elsewhere we do talk about alternative source, including seepage. It's mentioned. One of the things that kind of intersects here that we're still trying to understand fully is the agreements that some parties have with reclamation on seepage easements or agreements. I think they're called both ways, is how to quantify what that is. I don't know if those agreements, and look to George, those may not specify a number of a quantity of water, but they may result in a quantity of water, and we're going to have to agree to what that is in some manner. So that's to be determined. And I think there's several parties who have those seepage easements or seepage agreements along the San Joaquin River.
And you're only applying to the example of George's seepage easements, there's not, because there's no definition in this thing of
Right.
seepage.
So let's go to your example.
I find that problematic.
Let's go to your example. You have recognized in the GSP, there's recognized seepage that's credited to Stevenson. We just have to create an agreement that says this is how much and here's how the puts and takes of it account for. And that would be a recharge or a seepage quantity. Does that help? I know that
Well, it
kicks it down the
helps-
road
it helps
still.
in your and my conversations of understanding, but when you look at the document, it ain't nothing there, so that's what people that aren't at these meetings have a tough time with, because you just look back at the document and it's not a defined term.
In other districts, right, the Grand Rapids will have some sort of similar to Bob's seepage, right?
Yeah, there's. Well, all
Stream laws, what do you think?
that water's gonna get accounted for because. Their MID will give the Grand Rapids gets a receipt for how much they sold us. Everything that gets past the gate is included, some goes across the man, the rest goes to seepage, whether it's seepage seeps from the canal or in the field. All that's gonna be able to do that, although it will be from the canal. Which will go to account, right?
So we're gonna need to address those things, that if it says I bring water into the Grand Canal, just like Stevenson's situation of water in a canal, and there's a recognized quantity of seepage that has to get assigned to some parcels so that we know now who's using that, and we can, if you deliver 0 for 5 years, you can't say I'm using that, right? If the account's dry. So that's the only reason why we got to agree to it. They're going to have to be individual. Then somebody may build a recharge pond and actually bring water in, and all of it's going in. So that each one of those situations needs to get addressed. And that's why in section 1.8 4, it talks about defining those and creating that amount under 1.8 4 2 3. If you flip all the way to page 25, let's go ahead and jump there.
On that, on this, those are the ones not, the other situation is similar to Bob's, and then it's a water right, not necessarily purchased water, so there's not gonna be sort of a receipt transaction, but it's small water rights. Some of those get conveyed across other people's property and things like that. Small water rights off Fair Tree, Deadman, Dutchman, for example, and then even some small water rights off the River that aren't necessarily accounted for in seepage discussion.
And the
It's
child,
a hearing right, and they're submitting the receipts when they do their annual.
That's all it's diverted. I guess you submit that all the things your crop demand, when you do your statement of regarding the use.
Unless you can meter it and have some type of API, but we're years away from that.
there's
I guess it's.
there are details here that we're gonna have to address. We have to think about, was it a baseline condition that was part of the baseline groundwater? So seepage water running down streams and things is part of our baseline groundwater that is allocated back out as sustainable yield of native groundwater.
I'm talking about some of the water.
Those
So-
contracts.
New water, contracted water, other things, yes, those now have something. So let's just,
The way I understand the contract, Brad, or talking about would be more like a surface water delivery. It just.
I think that was something different.
I'm talking about a little water right that someone may have.
Off a creek, yeah,
Off a creek.
and that they're taking the water off the creek.
Yeah.
It's not surface water for them, might be, but
it's a surface water
contract.
supply.
And that, I understand you can get, it's pretty not simple, but straightforward. You're gonna get credit for all of that. It gets.
You just have to have to measure it out.
Crop demand. It's the seepage, if you're transferring that water across the property or things like that. It's, they're small water rights, but it's gonna matter.
Well, Greg, since you're not determining in recharge basins how much you're gonna be extracting, a percentage of what you're putting in. It won't be 100%, correct?
There will be leave behind requirements, absolutely.
Would you apply
Yeah.
that same leave behind requirement to these conditions?
You may.
So
And part of the reason, this, again, jumping to page 25, we talk about that under 1.8 4 2 3, the amount of water credited to the allocation management account will be determined on an annual basis. The amount of water credited will be defined and governed by a separate rule to be developed by April 1. That separate rule is gonna have to look at all of these things you guys are bringing up, and I don't want to get bogged down into those details here, but as just a point of reference, there are places in the US that have established grandfathered in kind of quantities without leave behind. And it suddenly has fully displaced all the native water because, hey, I have 100,000 acre feet stored in this aquifer that has a capacity of 100,000 acre feet of water. Well, now all of a sudden, it's just one person's. That doesn't work. So we know there's got to be something to address a decay element. What exactly that is, how, we got to work towards that.
That's one question.
Just one?
This one about seepage.
Okay.
So the seepage that the lady was talking about, and George, these seepage, what are these seepage agreements?
So there was a,
What are-
and George may be able to further define this. I know Larkin and Scott, Menifee has, well, Larkin does not, but Menifee has some, or has at least one. I think it's growers, individual owners in Lone Tree have them. I don't know if it's to Lone Tree. But what happened is reclamation and doing the San Joaquin River restoration flows was creating more flow in the river in places that were not seeing flow. Some of that was seeping out, sogging the soil outside within some distance from the river, causing problems for farming, whether it was, soil logging of the tree roots or just inaccessible lands or whatever. And they entered into agreements to mitigate that, either compensate financially or to address in other ways. In some places, they built slurry walls to stop that seepage, but that's pretty expensive. So those agreements were entered into by the landowner and the reclamation to acknowledge that effect.
So they've already been compensated for it. They secret agreements, they've already been
the-
compensated. and there's-
Well, part of the
Damage.
compensation is the water.
Right.
and they
And
can
then
pump it.
you get community, you get it.
Yeah.
All
right.
that.
So they bought the right to seek water to damage. Then there is free to mitigate that.
In the agreement, would there be a quantity of water they're allowed to intercept?
No, the quantity of water is variable depending on.
So as long as the river is flowing, so it'd be certain times of the year, certain times, you can't just run them all year long, and find the water, right?
No, the water all year long.
That's why they did it.
There's a base flow that comes from the farmland. We've had some of them in another one. But we have about 158 feet a month of base flow coming from farmland. Students restoration flow trucks. That one, they just follow it from the flood flow. Follow it down to the minimum flow, false flow.
Yeah, it flows through your drainage system.
So the flow with the pumps on the interceptors have run longer.
So the agreement we may need to reach, there's not going to be a perfect answer, is that historic quantity that they're able to demonstrate that's relatable to the San Joaquin River operations can translate to a quantity that goes into an account and is available to offset in that current year. Because that's an annual, that's when it's showing up, is when it's getting pumped and delivered, right?
That's not like a credit you could hold for 5 years, right? That's like. I know, but if you go to a 3-year drought, you're not gonna take in the 3rd-year drought, you're not gonna be there, right?
With one exception, if the extraction is then taking it a mile further up away from the stream, the source, and putting it in a recharge basin, construct a recharge basin, maybe there's a credit aspect. So these are, I mean, you guys are pointing out all the details that kind of play in and why we're saying, give us a little bit of time on that.
For George says, so those interceptor drains, it's just lift pumps in them, they're not actual irrigation. They're an interceptor drain. But it's at the end, it's lift pump, it's not an actual well. So you can have 7.5 horsepower. Yes, 7.5, yeah. On a system, one parallel to you. And you could have a meter and.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, you report it.
4 acres of water now.
It's a better water, yeah.
And so that'll create a quantity.
The problem is half the time when they run,
So-
no one needs it, that's the problem.
So-
Except if you're running, no one wants it.
So, hang on, one at a time. People online, we have. And so this just demonstrates that on each of these, we need to define what it is, and there's gonna be some agreement that GSA recognizes with Lone Tree. There's gonna be some agreement that recognizes with Bob. There's gonna be some agreement that recognizes with the Grand Athlon. Those have to be developed. Yeah, so those have to be developed. We do have, I guess it's dropped down to one, maybe Ellen dropped her hand. We have one hand, up. I apologize for not destroying the name. So you know your hand up. Can you go ahead and take yourself off mute and introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Eduardo Rojas. I'm with the Gallo Winery. I had a question about the allocation. Will processed water coming from the winery distributed to our field not used as irrigation count against our allocation?
We will have to talk further on this. The source of the processed water will matter. If the processed water is being extracted from a well, running through the system, used for process, and however many days, hours, months that's maybe affecting on a time lag, it still is water coming out of the basin. If it's sourced from something else, we'll want to know what that is, so that when we look at, if you take your processed water and you use it to meet irrigation demands out on vines, and we look at the irrigation demand on the vine and we say it used 100 units, and you only had I'm making up things, you only had 60 units of groundwater, you'll say, yeah, 40 came from my process water. Okay, well, we need to understand where that is so we can accommodate all of that and make sure we're within the allocation is appropriately being applied, and your other sources of water, if they're not groundwater, are being recognized.
Okay. Thank you.
So scroll back to page 3.
Anybody else online?
No more hands up online.
Perfect.
So we just took a while talking about alternative source, but that also plays elsewhere. You see, hopefully that was a pretty big add, a clarifier we felt was important. Hopefully that's helpful. As a result, it of course changed all the rest of the numbering. So that's why you see all those other edits. And then there was the thought of adding a common ownership, but the common interest language that's under on page 4, 1317 is functional for common ownership, and where common ownership showed up later, we changed it to common interest to be consistent.
What is the reasoning?
This has to do with the opting in of grazing land and whether you have owned it historically, and we used common ownership when we should have just used common interest instead of introducing a new term. So it was attempted. If you actually look back in history, the common ownership wasn't used. It was inserted and then deleted as part of this red line. So it shows up as a deletion, even though it never really was added, unfortunately.
I'll flag something for the board's consideration. Under the definition, this is in 1.3.17. Common interest are parcels owned and managed by a single owner or multiple owners. I am only flagging that to the board because when it comes to moving AMA from a account that you might be leasing, you don't own and manage that part. Maybe it's effective the way it is. I don't have an opinion on the matter. So I just wanted to bring it to everybody's attention just to review the document with that. In mind, I know Nick mentioned before that, you might be leasing a ground that you don't own and manage, you just manage it. So maybe a better language might be owned or managed. I don't know. That's for the board to decide.
The other part to consider that is there's some farm management companies that manage thousands acres, and maybe even what's the thing, want them to think that.
So it's the same question right there. Is it appropriate to be owned and managed, or is it owned or managed, or some combination thereof? Just flagging that for everybody.
So the second part of that, well, there's not a comma, the same second line towards the right-hand side says, or multiple individual owners where the joining of parcels is requested for purposes of managing an available allocation. There's where that was intentional, try and cover a farm management situation or something like that. So let's look at the entirety, but I understand your point, Lou. Let's make sure we're not creating a problem that is restricting. That's not the intent. The intent is from the perspective of the GSA, if somebody has exceeded their allocation and we need to come in and it's Brad, and we're like, Brad, you went over, you owe some fine based on the discussions there. And you're like, well, I wasn't one operating that. We have no idea. We have no way to go after Lou, who's managing that ground. The only person we have is you. So we're trying to say, you need to tell us something, though. If it's managed together, you need to show it so we know that it's common interest. And it's so we know somebody's got fiduciary responsibility ultimately for a challenge. That's the intent behind that. And so let's continue to look at the language.
Yeah, I think I appropriately understood the intent. I think when I read it after the redaction of common ownership, I thought that maybe there, it could be a little bit more clarified. This is all semantic stuff. This is ministerial. It's not substantive.
And I do think, again, common ownership got added and got deleted in the same version and didn't actually disappear. So it probably was never there before, and it may have created something that
Right.
is an artifact of just multiple
Maybe.
parties trying to edit a document.
Adriel and look at this offline and see if it's furthering the intent of the board.
We will do that.
I realize we're on different sides of the fence. It seems like it's the start of the softening of the language. It's gonna go all the way through and be crazy. To me, just reading it.
The removal of common,
Just reading this common, going from common ownership to common interest. And then there's a ton of changes in the grading later on. This seems. We can wait.
we can, yeah, when we get there, let's consider that, because I do think when we get there, we'll see that it does require an ownership of history, which clarify or further narrows what that part of common ownership to be only common ownership also. Common interest to only be the common ownership, as opposed to a management company that might be having multiples. All right, let's see, let's keep going. We've talked through a few of these edits we see under grazing land. And irrigated, this is again to clarify that this is the GSA's designation of land use, that we're starting with the assessor information. Same we see over on page 6 under managed wetlands. This again is to indicate that we started in one place, but this is becoming our own data as the GSA going forward. We go down to 1346 parcel. And I think that's just a clarifier that was for legal purposes. There are a few parcels that are bisected for some strange reason by the GSA boundaries. We need to deal with.
This might have also been the distinction between APN and legal person, which I think the GSA board is trying to
Right.
synthesize that down or
Right.
simplify it to just APN irrespective of the legal person.
Yes, yes. You are right. Thank you. Page 10, getting into groundwater allocation eligibility. There's some clarifying language. Again, several of those pieces of clarifying language are to address this fact that we're using the assessor data to initiate. And that's all it's for. And then it continues to be our data from there. With no questions, moving on to page 11. I'm also reading these because I'm refreshing my own mind to see what these edits were for in places. Okay, so 1413 has an ad there. The reason for this ad, and there might be a couple of things I'm going to recall. Is Jeannie online or not?
I don't think she is.
Okay. Jeannie, in putting her legal glasses on, looking closely, there's a couple of other tweaks to clarify a few things. It's not changing any intents, it's just the clarification aspects on some of this. This particular section was being written in this manner. Actually, I might have her changes. To address the fact that if you're not one of the parcels that we recognize as agricultural, you need to get permission from us to start using your allocation. We're happy to give you the allocation, but we need to get you in our system. And there are a few cases where it might be zoned commercial, it might be zoned something else. It's got functioning irrigated ag on it. And that's just an issue with the assessor's office and things like that. We're simply noting that legally you're absolutely able to get an allocation, but you can't until you come make sure we have this all straight and we recognize you in our system. You can't just hide under the radar. That make sense? Anybody?
not to complicate the language, but it might need to be.
Let me do my lawyer thing.
Yeah.
Let me-
Not to complicate, but let me complicate.
No, it might need to be an affirmative action on the GSA board to track down some of these parcels, because some people that have a commercially or industrial zone parcel are gonna keep their mouth shut because they wanna pump as much as they. There's nobody's policing them, so. Like,
That's
this,
it, Goose does.
Are you getting that term?
Sports Jam Martini Farms.
I think the long-term plan of Merced annexing everything up to the north by the UC, you know, it might need to be an affirmative step from the GSA board to just grab some of these parcels that are currently industrial or.
I would anticipate one of the things we'll be doing. Again, we're coming up, 2025 is gonna be this kind of dry, piloting year. As part of that, we're gonna see what are all the accounts that are registered and where is consumptive use, like we can look at OpenET, where's consumptive use occurring? We don't have somebody registered, and that will flag places we need to investigate. I've tried to catch myself.
That's a water term.
I think wasn't that Mike's request at one time? Thanks to Mr. Gallo. I'm very, very cautious on that
Hey, Greg.
terminology.
In 14124,
4124.
why do we need to update and correct? When it's updated and corrected, wouldn't we just do one of those and that was do both?
Probably.
Either with one word.
14124. Top of the page on the right there, it says updated and corrected. It seemed like one would go in. What's that?
Lawyer, got two lawyers.
Yeah. Paid by the word. Well, that's, yeah.
So, yeah, I'm looking at some changes in an email from Jeannie on 1413 that does clarify this a little bit on, again, it's more legal clarity. So that section there, you'll see, again, the intent is we'll take the clean version of this, which will have all the language as you currently see redlined, all accepted, and then it will modify that again, and that's the version that we'll be showing out there on the 5th. So any additional edits to a section like this will show up. I'm looking at her changes, and it's things like no parcel having instead of saying the way it says, right, any parcel determined by. It's just some clarity.
Sorry, I came in like, this is gonna be accepted and it'll be a version of it.
Right, so right now there are two versions available to you. A red line of this 812 and a clean of the 812. You're looking at the red line probably right now? Is that right?
Yeah, the one at the front there.
Yeah, that should be the
September 12th.
August 12th, 812.
Yep.
812 and it's red line. There is also on the MSGSA website a clean version of this same one. We would take the clean version, which recognizes or represents accepting all of these things, make some additional tweaks to things we're hearing from a few people, a couple of other cleanups. Like this statement right now about, oh, we don't need both updated and corrected. Okay, well,
When's the last day to give you?
it's the September 2nd. And so after September 2nd, we will, no more feedback, and we'll produce a new red line and clean version of that red line that would be going to the board and available out as a packet on the 5th will be I think the target, right? Somewhere around there. Whatever that Friday or that Monday before the 12th board meeting will be.
It'll still come out as a draft, right? And even at the board meeting, we may make changes.
Exactly.
But we're kind of hoping to have that all done and pretty close to real.
I mean, the big call now, big comments on this,
Right.
September 2nd.
And if you recall at the board meeting, what the desire was is have a version out there that's held for several weeks and everybody can react to that. Yeah, there's a couple little edits and things that are getting suggested. Those will be compiled and that next version will come out for the boards as a draft for board consideration. Does that help?
Then the board had a version to consider, it's been vetted a few times, and then you have between 12 to do your own decision.
Yeah, or at the 12th, there could be comments that are received and dialogue of the board, and they say, I like it, but let's, on this one, let's remove that word and change it to this word. And then adopt as edited, or however that has to go. Does that help? Okay. Find where I'm at here. All right, so moving 142, we can skip several pages to, we're going into at the about the middle of page 13, it starts grazing land. And onto the next page is where there's a lot of edits that relates to this situation of common interest, which requires it to be owned. I believe we'll look at to make sure that's all clear. And so on page 14 is where all the edits are, but it relates to this grazing land part and the opting in. So right now, you have two choices on opting in grazing land. You can opt in grazing land, put a well on it and start irrigating that land, and you get sustainable yield of native groundwater. In some instances, there was requests, and so this has been being accommodated in what we see on page 14, a request for somebody who has historic ownership where they want to opt in the grazing parcel, but not put the well on that parcel, but rather shift the allocation associated with it to existing irrigated parcels that they also own and operate. So that's what this is doing and attempting to do. And there was some back and forth about how broad or how narrow that starts to be. The language you see right now is intended to, and if you recall at our last workshop, and this might be helpful, we were talking about grazing right up against 400 acres of irrigated, and then there was another 400 acres of irrigated that was further away. And we were talking about that situation and trying to help set up something. We said that parcel of grazing that's right up against the irrigated and shares is contiguous. You should be able to opt in that grazing land and use it on that irrigated land. That was the direction. The reality is we have situations where that grazing parcel is maybe connected on a couple of sides to irrigated land. So we want to make sure that multiple parcels and that the irrigated parcel was also butted up on another irrigated parcel right next to it. And so that probably has interconnected irrigation systems. So we didn't want to force only the parcel up against the grazing land to be the only place where you could use that water, because we recognize the irrigation system was probably being operated across all of those contiguous parcels. So the language is clarified right now that contiguous grazing land, you can opt that in, use the sustainable yield of native groundwater allocation on any of the irrigated lands that are essentially all connected to that one grazing parcel. Does that make sense? That's what the language is intended, without trying to read through all the details here. If you started off and I had two separate parcels, let's say there's 3 irrigated parcels, 2 right next to each other and 1 further away, and I had all those in my management account and I was operating them collectively, and then I have a grazing land abutting those 2 irrigated parcels that are right next to each other. I want to opt in that grazing land. As soon as I do that, I got to create a new management account just for those parcels, the 2 irrigated plus the connected grazing. And I have to now separate that other distant parcel into its own or conjoined with some other parcels, but it cannot benefit from any of that allocation sharing to that more distant parcel. That's what is all here in the red and the blue, if that makes some sense. So happy to entertain it further.
Yeah, what's been changed is, let's say you have a section of 640 acres of grazing. Connected, 40 of farming, 40 of irrigated, 40 of irrigated, 40 of irrigated. And that whole 640 can go down to that whole 120.
Yes. capped with, you can't use any more than that 120 used to consume. And that 120, if it was connected to some other parcel, that had to be severed. So you couldn't now continue and try and leapfrog it further.
Who's got the call?
The GSA will see it with historic uses, the open ET analysis of what the use is in that period of time between 2015 and 2023. We can look at what that historic use was, put a cap on that property. So that opt-in parcel that somebody wants to do will be opt-in, and we may assign it, an opt-in type A. And that opt-in type A will now associate with a set of parcels that are in, and it will have a number that says this has to be capped at X, and we're gonna have to track that in the data. So it, adds administrative burden, but it gives some flexibility, because likely you have those 3 40-acre parcels are probably all interconnected with an irrigation system served by maybe a well in the middle or who knows what. And that now to have to separate all those out is not the intent of that historic grazing period, or historic farming operation. Does that make sense in that illustration? Okay. Agree or disagree, that's what it's saying.
Right, the 48-inch max, is that?
That also plays in 48-inch max, but if you were growing, I don't know, what's a low water use crop you guys want to throw out there?
Olives. We all like olives.
Okay,
Do olives take a little bit of water?
They take less water than other crops.
Let's go olives.
so let's just say that the use is right now olives. Yeah,
You didn't hear you, it's hurt me.
I did hear olives. I was gonna go grapes because I'm gonna go about the same. 20, they consume 24 inches of water instead of maybe 30 something that almonds might. So those 3 parcels, those 3 40-acre parcels are all in olives, and it's 120 acres consuming 2 feet an acre. It's 240 acre feet of water. You cannot exceed, even when you bring in that allocation, 240 acre feet of water. If you decide to now try and plant all 100 some odd to almonds, you're now going to be at 3 feet for that 120. You would not have enough water. You couldn't go to 360. Does that make sense? You're capped at that historic use of what that crop was using at that point.
At the end of the day, let's say the 340 for irrigated pasture using 4 feet of water. It could be flipped all.
It could be, but from that perspective, that's their historic, that's kind of their effect and their land. If they have enough grazing land that's contiguous right there, it shouldn't change that part. It won't be an increase. That's one of the things we want to protect against.
I'm gonna say this for what it's worth. I've actually fielded a lot of phone calls on this whole section, right? Just from people in the area, people, me, Goose, but we're all the same commission, right? And more people are struggling with this, they're in support, right? This whole opting in, it just makes things really confusing. And a lot of people don't like the opting in. I'm not picking on people who are in support of it or anything. It's just, it's this whole opt-in thing. I mean, if someone wants to take a piece of grazing land and wants to start farming it, so be it. Join the, in my opinion, and in a lot of people's opinion, work it, plant it. I don't care if the well is on the property, right? Just start farming, then join the party like the rest of us, right? But this whole opting in, people are struggling with it. I just want that to be known. I've had more conversations about the whole policy. They don't care about the 13 inches or the 20 inches. They just focus on this thing, right? And I know this was a problem in Madera County, right? Greg knows better than anyone. This was a problem, and I don't know exactly their situation, but these kind of things create a lot of problems, right? It just, this is when the gaming starts happening. We're all gonna have the game enough as it is, right? Let alone with these kind of things. It's just, I'm saying my GP, right? And, I'll vote the way I'm gonna vote, which is fine. But I would prefer all the irrigators, if you wanna start irrigating and join the park, right? That's, no one's stopping you from doing that, but that's how I feel. It's gonna warn people, this is a hot thing that may turn, if I was on the other side, say I had some irrigated next to 3 or 4 fields of pasture, right? I don't know if I would be happy with just getting the one that joins, because what's the difference? Why not just give me all I mean, at some point, right, in real reality, what's the difference? Why just get the one that adjoins the irrigated allocation? So, you know, just saying, this is gonna be a thing. It's just gonna be a thing. I feel lots of phone calls about it. And
I'm gonna,
We gotta have some process to opt in. So,
no, my
Now,
point,
you're saying you don't want people opting in?
no, I'm saying if you want the water, start farming it and you get the water.
Well,
That's all I'm saying.
we developed a lot of ground right after December 1st of 2023. And so they're not,
No,
considered- they're considered grazing right.
I'm just saying, if you're irrigating, you get an allocation of water. If you're not irrigating, you don't. If you, 2 years from now, you start irrigating, you get an allocation of water. You know, that's all I'm saying, right? I'm not trying to stop anyone from farming their property.
I'm gonna I want to make sure I'm clear on this. Your lands that are, that right now, the opt-in process, putting aside this moment of taking the allocation from that parcel and shift and not actually using it on that parcel and using it somewhere else. That's not your situation. Your situation is I have lands that I've developed. That is the traditional opt-in that's allowed. That is not, that is, and that's what Nick's saying. The question and the opportunity brought up by, you know, people like Lou, people like the Cranes and some other situations are, we have ground that we purposefully have not been irrigating. And we want to be able to opt that land in and we'll pay the fees associated with it, but we just don't want to now go spend money to develop that land when we'd rather use the water on our existing land. And we set restrictions that say you have to have owned this land historically. You can't go now do it and buy yesterday or buy tomorrow. And you can't use more than what you historically used. And if you ever sell any of those, it reverts back to that historic opt-in situation you're dealing with right now. So you couldn't try and develop it as a still grazing land, but you've taken the allocation and you've shifted it somewhere and then sell that off. We also forced you to lock it in with that irrigated land, and you now can't participate in any transfers with that count. So it was really trying to just say, all right, if the situation is legacy farming sustainably, we'll create that box and lock it in so that you limit opportunities for maybe misappropriation of water. Now, one of the other alternatives, all the way at the very last page, page 32, there is an add of a variance section. Is it defined? No, like other things, we'll develop it. One concept could be, and I'm not advocating one way or the other, but one concept could be any of these situations about this requests to shift the allocation and not actually irrigate that ground could all be addressed only through a variance where the requester has to demonstrate certain things before that board makes that decision in some ministerial capacity because the representation has been made that there's no impact to the GSA.
Page
Very back.
Yeah, sorry. Very last page, there's a variance section added.
All the way on the back. There you go.
The only problem with that though is, say someone's just asking for a variance on 90 acres, where the water's really insignificant to the basin. But then the next person down the road will, well, I want to deal with 100, 200 acres. So the same circumstance, well, got the guy with 90, where then you're starting to say, okay, yourself, either you're playing favorites or.
If we make it ministerial where you as the requester have to demonstrate, and it could be related to even do a CEQA representation, you have to do a groundwater study, you have to do something to show no impact. Yes, it shouldn't matter.
To me, that's getting a lot of gray area.
Which is why we have this other language here that we tried to contain.
He's not lobbying either, one way or another.
I'm
bringing up, whatever.
Let me lobby.
You got it.
Let me lobby.
I'd like to hear those people, but those people need to step up too.
They do.
Let me finish real quick. Starting the party, I don't know. Are you saying just take the grazing property as well on him?
No.
Oh, you're doing either one, either choice.
No.
Yeah.
No,
I'm just
he is
saying for-
growing on
for
the
this
grazing.
APN,
Yeah.
right, if we have this APN and this one, right? This one's currently grazing, this one's not. Right now, we're allowed to come up. I'm just saying, allocations should be divvied up on a 5-year basis or annual basis by the board by, depending on the irrigating lands that we know, of, right? Then say, Lou wants to start farming this piece, right? Start farming it. I don't care where the water comes, right? It can come from this parcel, it can come from this part, it can any. And then as soon as he says, I'm gonna farm it, right? Start farming, then you start getting allocations for it. You know, that's all I'm saying, right?
So quick question for you then, Nick.
Then stop farming, then
Okay, cool. You got this, we got this example here. This is 100 acres. I start farming 2 acres, and then I can take the rest of the water back.
oh, it's gotta be devastating. I mean, people wanna farm, it, right? I mean,
That's
But
what
then I'll farm with 1,000 acres and then bring a cow with it.
But what's the difference? If I
The
start
whole
farming.
point is to.
Let me see.
Yeah, but he's saying I can take water from here over there, so why can't I do back this way if I find?
Like,
This is crazy, and it's 100 acres. I'll pick 5 acres and I go farm. I drill a well, but I put it in the same account and I can take the rest of my sustainable yield somewhere else.
20,000.
no.
I'm just using simple.
Right,
I wanna hear Lou, I wanna hear Lou sell it.
No, well, first, hear me out, Nick, and I'm glad Nick's here because I think, you know, I'm gonna ask Nick to start with an open mind, and I'm also gonna preface. I'm gonna preface this with I'm not a litigator, so I'm gonna do my best here, as I understand it, but this is stuff that you guys wanna run for your own channels. I think the GSA has a tall task of balancing what are water rights associated with every property, the bundle of sticks as it's called, like for legal purposes. And being able to make sure that everybody keeps their water rights. In my opinion, it's a very, challenging subject. What, if you go to an adjudicated basin, some of the theories behind who gets the water are prescriptive and adverse possession remedies. They can be both in the form of a legal remedy and equitable remedy. What the judge is going to look at, I believe, and this is where I'm not a litigator, first and foremost, is your historical use. What have you been using for your property? Well, the people that have this historical pattern of contiguous rangeland, they've got 13.8 inches of percolatory water on that ground every year. They're contributing to the total base, they're paying property taxes on that. They're contributing to the total basic supply of water. So much so that if you cut out 100,000 acres of those people, everybody else in the GSA will get less water. Right? If all of a sudden the GSA is 100,000 acres less.
Oh.
Don't get too excited.
Yeah.
It's not that bad. So I think the dance here from the GSA's board perspective is saying, okay, these historical users who might have a lot of contiguous land that's contributing to the aquifer, they're paying property taxes on it every year. That ground is going into the aquifer in other ways. If you take it away from these guys, what does that subject you to as far as the form of litigation? It's one thing to put really strict guardrails around it, and you guys, I think, are have incredibly strict guardrails. This cannot be compared to you. You're saying you can't sell the water, you can't change your crop type, you can't expand your orchard, you can't do anything other than what you've historically done. So I would implore you to visit with Jeannie on that. I've spoken to people on, obviously, my brother's cowboy. I hear people on the other side of the table. And I know for a fact that this change of language has appeased some. I think it could be massaged to be a little bit better. But I think the dance you're doing is not for new people and the gamesmanship. Personally, I hear you loud and clear. I don't think this exposes you to gamesmanship, right? I think it insulates you. You can think of every way but Sunday for them to move water off of their property. But the gamesmanship, I hear loud and clear. Nobody wants gamesmanship. Nobody wants people to go start buying up rangeland. I mean, I guess I do, but nobody else does. You don't want people to be taking advantage of the situation. I think this is the balance of what if these farmers who have a ton of rangeland that's all contributing to the base, what is their historical use been? Because my belief is first and foremost, that's what the judge is.
So we have a couple of hands raised also that I want to make sure we're going online and getting some input. So we can come back into the room here in a minute, but let's go to Kevin.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Kevin Merced. My firm represents landowners in the basin. I think to echo the comments that were just made, the variance rule that was added at the end of the document doesn't doesn't fix the problem and the confusion that everyone's raising about these restrictions that are targeting grazing landowners here in 14237. You know, to be clear, this creates winners and losers under the rule. And we've submitted comments the past 2 rounds or so on this issue, but we're really just having trouble understanding what part of Sigma authorizes a GSA to regulate or restrict groundwater rights, or the phrase used earlier, the bundle of sticks, some of the sticks of those water rights on this level. You know, more generally speaking, essentially favoring landowners with current irrigated operations and allowing them more freedoms than landowners with just grazing parcels, and not treating them fairly. We understand the need to prevent a race to the pump house, which I think is the purpose of, like, for example, the January 1st, 2023 limitation in 142.371. Understand the intent behind that, but by including such a strict condition there, it's essentially permanently prohibiting sharing grazing land allocations with any other parcels except immediately contiguous ones within the same sustainability zone if they don't meet that retroactive cutoff date. And so we understand what the GSA is trying to do here, but we think we can work together with council to develop alternative solutions to ease some of these really strict limitations. You know, as we approach the comment deadline, there might be acceptable alternatives that don't require such stringent restrictions on grazing landowners here. One other quick issue before I hand it back over, 14234, just above. This provision prevents a grazing landowner who opts in from selling, like if they want to sell their land later, it prevents them from selling the land along with the opted in allocation, because in section 1.7 it goes over the rules and conditions for leasing and selling and transferring allocations between buyer and seller, or lessee and lessor. I think this may have been an oversight. I don't think it's the GSA's intent to prohibit grazing landowners who opt in from later selling that parcel along with the opted in allocation. So that it's a big problem if that's the case, because it totally reduces the land values of the grazing land that has been opted in and then the owner wants to sell later. So I just wanted to raise that as well while I had the floor here, but I'll turn it back over to the board. Thank you.
I just want to make one note on that. I know Kevin and Jeannie have been talking and are talking through some thoughts. So there may be some red lines that show up related to some of those questions. We did have one other online that we want to go to first.
That was Eric.
Eric.
Hello, Greg.
Hey, Eric.
Hey, you said something that triggered a thought of mine that is something that doesn't seem to be included in the document. And that is, you made a reference, and I put it in my comments, actually, a written comment. The allocation rule does define OpenET, but I was looking through the document because I know OpenET has a number of different databases within it. And I was looking through the document, and there doesn't seem to be a description I found of how OpenET is going to be used in verifying what people are actually consuming. So I'm wondering if you can direct me to somewhere in the document where how OpenET is going to play a role and which data set within OpenET is going to be used and how that is rolled into measuring how much people are using within these rules.
Yeah, I am looking at where we have either left it to be defined by April 1. I believe it's under 182 tracking of consumption. because we also have to address effective precipitation and how that gets brought in. So to your point, OpenET has an ensemble version, or they have several specific methodologies identified within them. We could choose one of those. We could choose any of those, but we are also creating the pathway through the platform that you could use an alternative, like maybe you want to have a separate contract with Land IQ or one of the other services, or you have meter data and you want to be able to bring that forward. There's alternatives that we need to allow for in the determination of the consumptive use. So it is still to be defined, Eric. but
Okay,
I agree with your point.
you had kind of made a blanket statement that OpenET was going to be the way. So it sounds like it's much broader and still not defined yet.
OpenET is the current way using the ensemble at this point as we go through the pilot.
Okay, thanks.
Bringing it back to the
I'll keep
room.
talking. I think my ask of the board differs from, I think he's an attorney who spoke, where he's saying all rangeland should get a parcel that you can sell and all of that. I think the board's got a tall task here, and we all need to restrict groundwater. I don't think there's anybody that would benefit from his idea better more than me. I mean, I'd be popping champagne, but that's not our request. That's not my request, it's his request. I think we all have a tall task here, and I think that the guardrails that the GSA is putting up are appropriate under the lens of historical ownership, where people did not go fence line to fence line, and people that are contributing to the basin. And this is based on, visit with Jeannie and visit with, all the appropriate entities on that. This is based upon both, my understanding of the way the adjudicated basins work. My only amendment would be, or request would be that any historical lands, not just the adjacent parcel, but if there's several adjacent parcels that are rangeland, can contribute there. Again, you can't sell it, you can't change your crop to more water intensive crops, you can't, move it across any parcel lines. You can't do anything other than what you've historically been able to do, which my belief is the first thing a judge would do. So that would be my request for the GSA.
Want to ask your question, Nick?
Well,
You said you had other questions,
one,
yeah.
I mean, I've never
Well,
been.
just
through-
one.
I've never
Just
been
one.
through an adjudication process, so maybe you have or whatnot, right? And I hope we don't have to get there, right? But I just, yeah. The whole intention of it is and I don't disagree, right? Well, the opting in thing is just for lands that didn't use it. I'm not saying they don't want to, and they can go start using it tomorrow. And I know the attorney that hopped on the thing said now his property's worth less. If he opted in, now it's worth more. That's what I'm trying to stop, right? You're opting in, now my property's worth a lot more, and then I sell it and now it's worth less. No, that land was always worth $3,000 an acre because of what it was. That's all I'm saying. Go ahead.
No, I agree with you. And I think you guys have put guardrails there, right? If he opts in, he can farm on his property.
Right.
And if somebody has contiguous historical use that they can demonstrate over a period of time, you can't change it to more water intensive crop. You can't go expand your acreage. You can't do, but you have contiguous use. Again, this is ground that's contributing to the aquifer. If this ground was not part of the basin would not get that water. I'll tell you, speak to my land on balance, just because of the land mass, is a net contributor to the basin. Nobody would disagree with that, right? And I'm not asking to add any more water. I'm not asking to sell the water. I'm not asking to do anything other than what I've been doing. Which again is a net, it's accretive to the basin. It's net on balance more beneficial to the basin.
Well, a couple of things. Earlier you made the comment about the 13.8 inches. I'm
Yeah.
assuming you're meaning rainfall.
That's right.
So how much of that rainfall stays on your property?
Some of it is.
Some. I mean, we used to own a section of hill ground, and after a wet winter, we went up to put post in, and you dig down about 3 feet and you no longer hit moisture in the ground. So, just because water hits something doesn't mean it penetrates it and gets into the groundwater. Now, and I think in your case, I'm thinking more, you've got some sort of recharge or seepage value greater than thinking that 14 inches of rain's hitting your property and you're gonna get all that, right? It doesn't,
In our case.
I'm not tracking
I'm trying
with,
to
yeah.
say, in our case, yes, but I'm saying, you know, basin wide, the rangeland does contribute to the net asset value of the basin. As far as the, you know, if you have the 180,000 acres of rangeland extracted from the basin would get some amount less of water. I'm not a water engineer.
Yeah,
you know.
I'm not either, but I don't think that's true.
Well,
I own, you know, my family.
Let me
Oh, yeah.
make
We're getting
a
off track
statement,
here.
yeah. First off, and I've said this many times, we are not going to get an absolute answer that is perfect, because this is that you cannot find an absolute answer. There are situations where some percentage less of percolation may be occurring on certain parcels. It could happen anywhere in this basin, depending on, you might have a clay lens 5 feet below, and that percolation is not getting down either, and it's actively farmed. So we don't want to get into that speculation realm. One of the things, I think to the point, was we tried to put guardrails around this. One additional concept of a guardrail, if there is a worry well, let me preface what I think Lou is asking for is not just that one grazing parcel that's contiguous, but potentially others that are stacked within a contiguous parcel. With all the other guardrails, they should all be allowed. One, if that is a worry, maybe there's an add of, if we are not moving towards our objective of sustainability, groundwater levels are not coming up, those are the first to get cut back. Yes, you could go drill a well and irrigate that ground. I mean, it's just trying to think of other pathways here. And you may have the same absolute impact, but the sharing of water and the shifting of allocation onto existing irrigated, if it constrains our ability to meet our objectives, because that's what the GSA cares about, maybe then that triggers some other restriction on lands that have opted in to shift that allocation
Or,
as a possibility.
and this is gonna piss some people off, not in this room, but this will make other people upset. Or if somebody opts in to do that, they get a portion, they get
A
half,
fraction, right?
half of the sustainable yield.
Yeah.
You know, because 13 more, you know, but we've got ground in our property that has got really high saggy ratings where the water just goes straight to the aquifer. So we got stuff with that, and we got everything in between. Got rivers running through. So I know some contributes to the aquifer.
So, do we have?
But I think
I'm off.
my point being is,
Raise
and this is not, trust me, this is not from me, you guys. We can talk offline if you guys have questions about this. I've talked to other people, and my point being is, I think historical usage is important in evaluating this.
Well, and one other thing you said, I just want to get on the record, is that this document in our GSA in no way tells anybody what they can or can't grow on their property. You made the comment that this is changing what we can grow. That's not the GSA. That's your amount of water and what you decide to do with it.
Point taken.
Okay.
One thing on historical use, in the southern part of the basin, historical use has got us in this trouble. They've overused.
We could argue without getting to pointing fingers anywhere. We're all in this together. We are, as a GSA, trying to address and control locally and keep the state out. So this rule is being set up to be able to self-manage towards the sustainability objectives. There are, and we've talked about this before, many different edge issues that we're trying to address.
You're trying to play PR right now.
I am.
But Dave, to your point, yeah, you can say the South caused the problem, but the people that didn't develop their lands, not the problem. The problem is everybody that is pumping water right now. So that's the counter to that argument.
Yeah, but I'm just saying we can't use historical as our only basis.
But his historical is different than someone that's farming 100% of his ground.
Yeah.
As far as causing the problem.
I don't think
So-
there's no right answer here. One option would be maybe a group that, and again, it's not gonna make everybody happy, but if you elect to opt in for historical use, you get half of this. You don't even get the APA already, right? The APA is gone. But then you get half of the sustainable yield. And the sustainable yield will go up and down over time with what the basin's gonna allow.
And that's gonna be determined every 5 years or so.
Yeah.
right? Yeah, it's gonna change.
And I know that won't make everybody happy, but I do know that everybody's trying to find a.
Trying to get a starting point so that 5 years from now, we have something to look back on and see if we're making any progress. If we're not making progress, then it's gonna all be reevaluated.
Speaking of making progress, let's get back on.
We got dinner tonight.
I got dinner date.
Okay,
Upgrade if you want for now.
the additional concepts of what Lou has suggested, we have noted some ideas. It is in a place right now, I think the board will have to consider, continue to consider this of how it's implementable. I will just make the note here, this is a pilot for this year. One of the things we could use that is understand the way it's implemented. And if you did some different things, what would it maybe mean? That might be something to evaluate during 2025 and see, is there room to accommodate something slightly different? We're trying to not just say, here's the rules, go. We're trying to say, here's the rules, let's test.
We're working hard to try to find the middle ground. At the end of the day, though, I don't think we're restricting anybody, because anybody can drop a well on their property and go to work.
Right.
So we're not restricting anybody in any way, and I think Jeannie's.
Correct.
We're not.
Exactly. And the argument is, could be made, hey, develop your ground if you want to. Well, it's not developable. Okay, well then maybe you wouldn't have gotten an allocation. So I get all of the sides of these arguments.
The hard part.
That to my question I had for Nick earlier, but as a whole, if you can develop your ground, are you gonna be able to put that ground, does that ground have to stay in its own AMA? Or if you develop it, can it be in a joint with another parcel?
Currently written, if you bring in grazing land and opt it in and start irrigating it, it has to be in its own AMA.
Well, what about if we as a compromise, well, that's gonna be about the same as we're doing now, we change that, or can, if you develop it, whatever you can develop as part of that ground, then it can be in use.
Then you run into the situation, you develop it for a year, or do you have to develop it for some period of time? You do it for 1 year. You faked it and then you shift everything off.
That, then opting in.
Right, there's challenges and there is history. There's no. I work with a lot of lawyers and they, a lot of them are they're all gonna work towards their opinion is correct. The challenge is that there are different interpretations in between settlements and stipulated agreements and adjudications and other things. Some recognize dormant water as a secondary right that is maybe in some cases has no chance unless somebody else gives up water. Other places they actually get water supplies and opportunities. Those are so case specific that we're trying to create something that is functional, implementable for 95% of the situation in this basin. These discussions here are the edge issues. They're taking a lot of effort and focus, and I get that, and I understand why. We have to find that balance, and that's the challenge for the board, is finding that balance. So let's move. Can we move? Okay. I did want to note, sorry, this was something that was added and it is important because this may create in the grazing thing, if you have a current easement, sorry, page 14, on the grazing opt-in concept, if your parcel has an easement that does not allow irrigated agriculture, you cannot opt that land in and shift that allocation because you wouldn't have been able to grow anything on that ground because you already got paid for that easement.
Good.
I don't know whether that exists in a lot of places or not, but it could.
There's a lot of guardrails.
Moving on now to page 18. What do we have here on page 18? Okay, this was a change and a request and a discussion amongst the board that where we have, this has to do with adjustments on the annual APA and whether or not it pauses or resumes or starts to recover, has to do with the determination of some accountability for uncertainty in measurements and determining things like an arithmetic average of groundwater levels across the sustainability zone. And the change now says under 15282, Groundwater levels would be determined pursuant to this other section and will incorporate a measurement of uncertainty buffer defined as the greater of 5% of the defined fall 2015 or fall 2011 values on a depth to groundwater basis, or within 5 feet of the defined fall 2015, 2011. The point is greater than and went 5% instead of 10%. So it's either
One or the other. Why do you, 2 different years as references?
so one is about
Minimum threshold.
minimum threshold is you got to be at least above the minimum threshold before you get a pause. 2011 is when you can start resuming and getting water back, getting an increase. So that is under on the prior page under 17.
That's the one available.
That's the whole drill. Under 17, if we've actually gotten above, and conceptually, if we're declining our consumption and we're increasing groundwater levels, they're gonna hit 2015 and they're gonna keep coming up. And they're gonna keep coming up and keep coming up, so we should be able to allow more pumping again at some point. So then we're bouncing around that management objective, which was set at 2011.
Does it say anywhere if we do somehow hit 2011 levels that APA goes away and we have the sustainable yield number?
That is-
It's the same thing, right?
That is incorporated within the whole definitions of sustainable yield of native groundwater and APA. Optics and terminology wise, APA is gonna go away because it's considered an additionality. The sustainable yield of native groundwater should reflect what that data is showing. So if you are at 2011 and that means you're pumping and you're consuming the equivalent of 20 inches of sustainable yield, then that's what your new sustainable yield native groundwater should be determined to be. And that's how it's written right now. Right.
Are you able to produce maps that show current conditions versus those levels?
Yes, yes. They exist.
I know there was a huge debate on actual what are fall 2011 levels. There's such a such lack of data in our GSA.
And I've seen data come in and out of the maps over
Yeah.
time, so
Yeah.
is there the map? The map we can.
What we say,
We're recurring out there, right?
monitoring,
Have it.
Whether it's that.
Yeah, it's a, what do they call that? It's a,
so
yeah, but it's a made up.
on page 18 under 15281,
Model.
Say that number again.
Hard data.
page 18, 15281,
Yeah.
Nick.
15281.
We see at the very bottom of this, the idea of a monitoring network approved by the GSA by April 1. The intent of that monitoring network is to accompany with maps that shows, here's how we're calculating it, here's what the 2015 and here's what the 2011 numbers look like. But there's, because of these issues on what wells exist, what wells do we want to add, there's some new ones. How do we create 2015 for a well we want to add that wasn't measured? We have a backwards path that Woodard and Kearns developing.
And generally, is there a thesis among the GSA board that the more data points, the better? Or
Generally, you see in the beginning, the upper part of that same paragraph says minimum of 1 monitoring well per 5,000 acres. So that is the thesis of the
I think more data.
Oh, for sure. Or the improvement.
like 100,000 acres. No, it wasn't that high. Yeah, it was a lot larger. And, you know, this is something, and give Eric credit. He was the one who was saying that's too big of a space. We need it smaller. So we're trying to accommodate the fact that we have a lot of data gaps. We need to determine what 2011 and what 2015 looked like with new wells based on other proxy information. And so we're trying to give ourselves a little bit of time to do that, but that's why that 2015 data is there. And that would accompany maps, to your point, Brad.
I mean, that would be, so there's, if we have 2 monitoring wells, I want to, this one is 12,000 acres. Basically, really, you have 2 more in Oneida, 10,000 acres or so, and you're covered, so it's not unrealistic.
No, it's not unrealistic.
In ag areas, yeah.
And you have Larkin's got some wells down in that area too, and we can add a few more, so I mean, we should, yeah. Okay, moving on.
Can you may not even go, you may go right by 1.5, 1.2, 1.10.
Let's go there.
What
It
page is
didn't
that?
have markup, so that's why I was going by it.
Yeah. This is the point that-
Page 18. Scroll down.
When this
Down to the
new-
bottom.
when this new draft came out,
Yeah.
it made a complete distinction between sustainable yield native groundwater. That it's just it only involved native groundwater. With respect to the additional pumping allowance, this was a transition water. The notion of this pause was able to allow, that those that have benefited the basin by not, going below, 2015 level, that additional pumping allowance remains. However, in 2036, it's all gone. It's all gone with this document. So, that does not seem to serve the purpose of having a additional pumping allocation pause to begin with. Why is it that 11 inches, let's say, we were able to keep sustainable until 2036, and then bang, 11 inches is gone.
But the theory behind that model is that in 2036, if you guys are staying level, your sustainable yield will go to.
Will go up.
To with that 11 inches.
But that's not what that's not what's being said here.
It is,
Anywhere.
it is on page 16 at the top. Future adjustments, and this is sustainable yield of native groundwater, is the carryover of the definition of that. That will be reevaluated every 5 years, and adjustments will will potentially increase or decrease in each sustainability zone to reflect the effects of local circumstances on the GSP objectives. So if we are at 2015 levels and bouncing around, or you're just above it or wherever, your sustainable yield native groundwater is going to increase. That's what that language says.
All right.
That's why it says it there. As opposed to an automatic conversion of APA, it's the same thing, but it's happening under that statement right there on that term. As long as the data is supporting that, which it should, from your history and what you guys represent, it should support that concept.
Okay, so that, my concern is taken care of in section 1.5.4. 1.5.14.
I believe, and I think that's always been our intent of how to try and address your request associated with that situation.
Okay.
It lets the conditions at that time dictate on it.
Right.
And it'll be reevaluated every 5 years, right?
Right. And this, again, starting point was we didn't have enough data to differentiate right at the get-go, so everybody got 13. In the future, we anticipate seeing varying numbers in each zone.
Yeah, my next point was, why have different zones if everything's gonna be the same number? Okay,
Because of that right there.
All
That
right.
statement captures that intent. Which means we got to have better data to be able to get the monitoring wells, which is why we have to agree on a network that makes sense, that gives us those levels and allows us to feel confident that we're achieving the objectives and being able to tell the state, we're meeting our goals. Leave us alone. Okay.
We have a question online.
Question online. Eric, you have your hand raised.
I do. So I'd submitted a written comment on section 1.5.2.10.10, I guess, that you just were discussing.
Yep,
And
I have it in front of me.
Okay, so that was to actually explicitly state that whatever the sustainable yield native groundwater number and the APA was at the conversion in 2036, that those would be added together to create the new sustainable yield native groundwater number for a sustainability zone. Because what's being said in the next section that you talked about was that some recalculation will be made, but it doesn't explicitly say that you will get basically where you were at in 2035.
Wouldn't,
The reason why, Eric, is that the APA, that's gonna go away, right? It's no longer gonna exist. So you can't take that and add it to the native sustainable yield and come up with a number. That's the point.
Well, what I'm saying is if at that point, if you're pumping sustainably with that combined allocation, why wouldn't you just state you're gonna get that allocation as your sustainable yield native groundwater for that sustainability zone?
Wouldn't we set that in 2035? I mean, if all the numbers are coming in like as they should, Eric, wouldn't that number just be set every 5 years?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's constantly gonna be monitored.
Yeah.
Your
Yeah,
sustainability.
I don't think this document is to intend that you're gonna be guaranteed water in 2036, right? I mean, we don't know what's gonna be like in 2036. I imagine Stevenson proposal is probably gonna be great. So, I mean, I'd say
good.
but, yeah, so, I mean,
The intent again is to, just like every place else, we're finding balances between ensuring the GSA has if things went crazy and suddenly you're at well below 2015 levels out in Stevenson, you don't automatically get some bigger number.
Well, if that were true, Greg, wouldn't the APA have already been decremented because you were below it year by year?
It should have been.
Yeah.
So we should, the reality is, maybe I'll just say it this bluntly, I guess, is that what you're intending and what you're writing there should be the result, but we shouldn't be saying that is exactly what's guaranteed, because I think that creates both an optics and a potential liability consideration for the GSA.
Okay, then, and I guess
Absolutely there.
I guess what I'm striving for is stronger language than what's currently in the document. So that's probably what I'm striving for. But thanks for listening to me.
Wouldn't we also, if we get to 2011 and we've gone through a pause, go above our APA and it would actually be sustainable?
You'd basically have a sustainable yield of native groundwater that might be bigger than 24 inches, right?
Exactly. So
Yeah,
we could be above what we're all talking about now, if we could get to 2011,
right.
sustain that for a while.
could there be an opposite situation where by 2035, say a area has not reached minimum threshold and they've already run out of APA, but they're still not meeting it? Having that specific language would prevent them from the sustainability zone possibly going lower because they haven't found that sustainability yet, right?
Yes.
Which is why we don't want to say that.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, like, it's just, so it won't limit that possibility.
So
right?
adding that language could be used to detriment and not being able to adjust somebody downward is the point,
Okay.
I think. Hang on.
All right, I just want to say something, guys, so it's fun. I like everyone in the room and everyone on the phone, so it's great. You have any questions for me before I leave? I have a Facebook.
So if I may, just, we're gonna take a 2-minute recess, okay? And before you go, so are all of you familiar, or any of you familiar with SB 1390? Right, so that vote could happen this afternoon. I guess I want to share that our GSA is opposing SB 1390. Right.
I'm sorry, I'm unfamiliar.
So SB 1390 says that you can't take floodwater off the streams up here until the delta is flooded.
Well, more importantly, did the county pull a support letter of it?
I believe
The
so.
county had a support letter.
I didn't, never came across my desk. But I'm not the chair, so sometimes that doesn't happen. But
the chair now?
Rodrigo Espinoza.
Yeah, county had a letter of support they sent a few weeks ago, but supposedly it was pulled. 1390.
Okay.
Pretty sure it was pretty.
Yeah, because we sent one today. We sent one today opposing it.
So there's a request for a 2-minute.
Yep.
Recess.
Yes, or how close
That
are we
was-
to,
was
how
that-
close are we to finishing?
We're
We
here till
are,
4:30.
I'm not gonna finish in like 5 minutes.
Okay, I mean, I've just been texting on that and distracted a little bit, so I
we are,
just wanted
we
to
are
let you know
close.
why.
We are very close to finishing,
Okay.
but if you want a break.
Does anybody need a break, restroom break? Grab a, okay, we're good, keep going.
We're good.
Yeah, all right. I'll wear my farm gear.
All right, so we are not taking a break. We are continuing forward. We are now at page 23, I believe. Or page 23. There's no edits until we get to page 20. Well, actually even beyond 20. 23 starts monitoring. And this is an area that has been discussed. I just want to clarify a couple things again. That the intent on monitoring, and we need to define some of this, you're given a bucket of water of groundwater. You may have other sources that are unique to your situation that are other than groundwater. We're going to, using OpenET at this point, estimate consumptive use of applied water, subtract that from your bucket that you have available and assess where you are, and then add that year 6 to your bucket, and you continue forward. A couple of things that we have to get to, and that we're gonna have to discuss in the board, amongst the board, amongst ad hoc, and in public session over the next several months, is effective precip. So you see that showing up on page 24 under 183. There are a variety of ways that people are starting to think about this and are addressing it throughout GSAs up and down the state. I'm not going to get into details, but we'll need to say that, and we need to figure out what that is and how we want to reflect it. We also then need to understand how we're going to, in detail, how you're going to have demonstration of those alternative sources, which include recharge, whether that recharge is seeping recharge or some other form of recharge, and surface water either under contract or right. And that right, I don't want to say right, or additionally a floodwater thing, now that you just mentioned that, Bill. Opportunities to divert floodwater is not a right, but it will be a credit to recharge in some way that we'll need to look at. So that there's a fair amount we need to build out on 183, but all of that is about trying to account your use against what you have in your bucket, and then you add next year's, so you know what you have going forward from there. And that will be on an AMA and account management basis. And you may have one field, one parcel in there, you may have multiple parcels within a zone that are all part of that will be helping you manage. Now, sorry. One more thing, thinking of the dairy side of here, we do have the need to address on page 25, 185, accounting for non-agricultural land uses with agricultural land use classifications, which is where, I believe that's where. No, we may have it misframed right there, but the intent is there are parcels. So there's your dairy operation, your silage pits, your milking, your loafing, your turnaround areas, your buildings that are part of your gross footprint of your land that have a consumption associated with it. Poultry has got its own situation. Like Nick's production facilities have some use that happen with his processing facility. Dairies have some use that are happening that aren't going to be able to be seen by some sort of remote sensing as a tool. And we're going to need to develop what that number is. For dairies, we've been deferring the intent to Jeff Van Den Hugel's California dairy milk producer. They did a study with 4 creeks that defined a per acre consumption off of dairy parcels that were not in the irrigated portion. So for those situations, poultry the same, we're going to need to take the parcel, define an area that says this area, maybe there's a 50 acre block out of your 200 acre parcel, That's your dairy footprint, and it's gonna have a consumptive use number. But it gets an allocation for the whole footprint. It's just how we're gonna subtract a use off of it. We're gonna need to have that defined under some of these sections. Poultry, we had a conversation with Foster Farms the other day. They have some different numbers. We're gonna need to look at how we accommodate those, because there is a use, it's being pulled from groundwater. And there's a consumption that's
They're not
associated.
watching.
No, they're not. It's a lot smaller, but they've said it's anywhere from almost a tenth to 1.1 acre feet per acre. They said some of their facilities actually do use a fair amount. So
Probably do wash down.
they may, and it's also, they may be trying to keep them cooler. They're running more misters in those poultry barns. Anyway, those are factors we'll have to figure out. Those are going to be addressed so that we're appropriately reflecting that use. I do see a hand raised.
8.5.
That's the intent of 1.8.5. I think we had more language in there and then we redacted and just put, we'll define that by April 1.
George had a question too.
George first, and then we'll go to Ellen.
Thinking about the fact that we have the charge against the parcel. Those,
Can you speak up a little bit?
those acres that were considered. And so, the consumptive use would be considered everything that's growing on that property, and we've got, I don't know, the curve, we've got probably 5 to 10 miles of frontage on San Luis. Not flowing frontage, but growing, made up of brush, weeds, and trees. And that's all gonna be given off the signature that's being charged against our overall
Well,
application. It almost leads me to think, why have to do scorched earth?
No,
out there?
we don't, you bring up a really good point that we'll need to make sure we're clarifying and addressing. If you are in a situation, it's similar to, I have grazing land, no irrigation on it, and it had a high signature because there was lots of rain. There was no irrigation occurring on it, so we need to make sure that doesn't count against you. How exactly we do that? Because in that case, it's not effective precip creating that consumption. It's surface water interaction. We need to.
When you're in, typical San Luis River is.
Yeah.
It's doing this on curving around, and you go out to the center of the river as far as your parcel boundary, and it starts to add up. I mean, it's not huge, but it's, when you're looking at, you're looking at 13 and 11 and going down, you're looking for everything you can.
I think what we're gonna want to do on that is twofold, because one, we don't want to be in a situation where we've given you all the allocation credit for that, but yet then don't use that to look at use, right? If all that land out to the center of the river, maybe there's a redrawn parcel for some of those pieces and your parcel is defined uniquely. And the consumptive use for that unique footprint and the allocation for that footprint is established. Does that make sense?
I just don't know how to account for it.
Yeah.
Is there a way to draw a boundary around that vegetation and then have it just subtract it out?
I think there should be in the groundwater accounting platform, all of that is there. It's a matter of how we go through that process and define that. So that's what I was just looking at the appeals process to try and address that. I think that, but it's a great point. We don't want to.
I didn't want to run a lot of time on it.
Ellen, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I have a similar question, and I raised this in the last workshop about the situation where you have one large parcel that might have irrigated agriculture on it or stock watering, but also have a wetland, a managed wetland. And you said to, see if those existed and then we'll talk. We are just finding a handful of parcels that have, say, 50 acres of almonds and 150 acres of wetlands on a single parcel. So is your advice to maybe work with the GSA through the appeals process or possibly through this to be drafted section to address that? Or would you suggest that we submit comments in this round to kind of request some consideration for those kind of situations.
Ellen, these properties don't have conservancies on them, do they?
So you can have an easement on half your parcel, unfortunately, or fortunately. And in these situations, you'd have the wetlands would be under permanent easement, but the remainder of the parcel would not be.
Or what's under permanent, is gonna be excluded anyway.
So my opinion, and this is just my opinion, would be to, for the record, submit an indication that you want to make sure that these things are addressable on a individual basis by the GSA and that the process allows for that consideration.
Okay, thanks.
Again, that's my opinion. Board.
I think it's good. Go ahead, Ellen, do it that way.
And then I do think the appeals would allow that to be addressed, but I think just getting it on the record. Because it does probably play into whether the underlying, like looking on that Merced County GIS tool, if it says irrigated land, it's got an allocation for all of it. Different than if it was designated as managed for grazing. So
Yeah, so during the opt-in wetland preservation option under the policy, we're just interested in maybe pursuing that, but it wouldn't be for the whole parcel. And I know that right now, the policy doesn't contemplate that.
okay, yeah, I would get that in writing, and I think that would be an area that can be addressed in the appeals, but it would make sense to have it documented. Let's move to.
Can I ask just a question?
Sure.
Page 25, the opt-in eligibility process.
That's where I was just going. You read my mind, Bob.
Yeah, the date one and date two, I don't really, what's going on there?
There was a initial discussion at this, and first off, I think it should be clarified prior to adoption in a week and a half or whenever on the 12th. I think it should be clarified. Originally the thought was, okay, you need to make sure we know who's in by November 2025. And then we're going to run for a while and you'll have another period of opportunity to opt in every 5 years. That was the thought, is we'd create a window so then the GSA has time to make sure we get all these things properly logged. We should probably have something there so people can more accurately comment on whether they like that or not.
Wasn't that date also put in there so people didn't go out and buy property and?
Those are other dates.
Okay.
In fact, the designation date in the next paragraph about January 1, 2015 and January 1, 2023, that exists. This was about, if you don't opt in this 3-month or 6-month window or 12-month window, your next chance will be in 4 years. We were wanting to maybe clarify that. Maybe we want to just strip that and say you can opt in at any point in time, but it's should at least only occur on an annual basis because we can't mid-year opt people or give them an allocation.
I mentioned before, there should be in a cropping situation before a crop would be typical cropping year, in a cropping season kind of thing.
I would imagine if you're going to opt in, so this is land that is grazing, most likely, or maybe managed wetland, that you're making the determination to start farming that next year, so you can make a determination and let us know that prior year in some window. So that's an open area to make sure we clarify. Bob, was that it on that?
Yeah, and my only other thing is that there's been mistakes on our incorrect land use codes. That we should get that straightened out with the assessor's office by when. Yes, you gotta pay back fees.
Right, there's an appeal process, but I would say that those aspects we should get taken care of during this trial period and get it clarified so we can address all those
What do you think about Bob's question, said the county takes, to me, that one's more of an open-ended one, you're dealing with the county, Bob, you might not be able to hit that date. Because of how long the county takes to work.
The reason why we had the language at the front end that says the assessor's data is only initial, we don't care what happens with the assessor's office. If Bob wants to go change a designation with the assessor for whatever tax purposes, that's between him and the assessor. We recognize right now as a starting point, and I think this is true, some of your land is designated commercial. We see that that's farming. You're gonna want to get an allocation for it. We're gonna need to just deal with that. We'll get it changed in our data set. If you ever change it with the county, that's between you and the assessor. So we don't want to get caught up in their timing and their business.
Okay.
And that's why we changed it up front to say that, because they were complaining to, or Ashley.
We're gonna do this. We did 218 different land assessments based on grade,
Yeah.
for agricultural. So we had a bunch of people that wanted to change and grade not done.
So it'll be done in the accounting platform and you take the fees at that point. And then we talked about whether the fees could be staggered over a period of time if there was a large amount of fees. I don't know if we've ever addressed that.
I think it's still open-ended and it hasn't been clarified one way or the other, but I don't think it's. I believe the language about those are not definitive enough to say that it's not a possibility. What, if your suggestion is we should make it more definitive, we can,
One of our meetings was.
I do recall something.
Selling or what is it, but they're afraid someone's gonna get a great big bill all at once, can't handle it to get in. Or could we take it over time?
I'm looking on page 26 at 19112. Trying to see, or any of these sections here, if it talks about providing that
Flexibility and
flex,
things.
right?
Yeah, we appreciate you raising that. It's just more clarity about the timing of when folks are gonna be able to opt in and what that means for their decisions financially, what that will require, and maybe some request for flexibility. It would be great if the opt-in period could be every year, just in case people can't pay all those fees in that first opt-in period, or if there was at least an extended consideration if the fees are large for the payment.
See, we were listening to you, Alan.
Yeah,
I was supporting you. Thank you for raising it again.
okay. I've marked that to make sure we don't. And we'll look to clarify. Moving on through, there's language that's been added on page 29 under appeals. Basically takes us almost to the end. I'm wondering if it says it in here. This is again, just clarifier on the mischaracterization of lands and fees. So again, it would be, add flexibility in payment. And then we go all the way to the last page. Where'd you go? And we added this variance section to provide an opportunity when we know there are additional edge issues. We wanted to at least create a pathway that if an owner or a land user wanted to do something that wasn't otherwise recognized through here, that there's a process that they could bring that forward, that the burden will be on them to demonstrate that it is not an adverse effect or a redirected impact. So that's the extent. Any news, Lloyd?
It hasn't been voted on yet.
All right. And that takes us to the end. So we can go back to any other comments, questions people have on any of the sections in case we skipped over anything. I don't see any raised hands. I don't think there's anything more or any questions raised specifically in chat.
I had just one, you understand this better than I do, I got confused with, 1.3.1.
Why?
Which page are you on? Oh.
Three.
Page three?
It's the definition of applied water, and I don't really understand the last part of that definition. Total amount of water is diverted to any source to meet the demands of water, which is from any given parcel, and now it's where I get confused. Without adjusting for water, then completed, return to develop supply, considered for total.
What that
What does that
means, yeah, what that means, appreciate that. We're gonna go very simplistic. You're flood irrigating an alfalfa field, you have a certain amount you're putting out. If you meter that, you push that on the ground. If you're super inefficient, high rate of application, a bunch of that's gonna run off the other end. Super sandy soil, maybe irrigating too long, a bunch of it's gonna deep perk. The applied water is only the amount that was put on, regardless of the fate of any of those molecules, whether they were ultimately consumed by the plant or whether they ended up running off, surface runoff, or deep percolation.
Three.
Bottom.
Applied water.
Basically what the plant uses,
Now, applied water is what you put on the ground.
even though it penetrates, runs off everything.
Then we have evapotranspiration of applied water. We have evapotranspiration and evapotranspiration of applied water, where ETAW, evaporation of applied water, so on page 5, is a subset of evapotranspiration met through purposeful application of water regardless of source. Maybe we should just do a search for where applied water shows up. We were trying to make sure we had a term defined for every place we maybe used the term.
Hey, Gino, while Greg's looking that up, if you go up that page to 134.
Yeah, it's under 1318 is where we use applied water.
What about the animal feed?
Yeah, should that be CAFO
No,
instead of?
No, because Greg says capital doesn't cover everything.
it's a
Okay.
CAFO is, yeah,
There's a-
the genie pointed this out, that has to do with
There's a
either,
time limit on capital, like for larger operations, so it wouldn't cover every animal operation. This is supposed to
Right.
cover-
Well, this covers.
and I think it's a federal versus state designation or something,
Yeah,
so
I forget
AFO,
the details, but
yeah.
Okay.
Jeannie brought it up.
So,
and she said it must be AFO, not CAFO.
Okay, no problem. So where'd you find it?
So under 1318, which is on page, so under consumptive use on page 4, this is where applied water shows up. And we see towards the bottom there, so consumptive use is the water within a system that cannot be recovered or reused. It includes water that is consumed by plants or humans, animals, evaporated or contaminated. For purposes of this rule, this also is a subset of evapotranspiration that can be referred to as evapotranspiration of applied water. So that's why we define applied water. It's the water you put onto a field, as opposed to precip, rain. You didn't put that on, nature put that on.
Have a raised hand also.
Okay. Raised hand. Kevin, you have your hand up?
Yes, thank you. Just a quick comment on the last part of the rule, the variance, or maybe there's the appeals, but at the end, you're discussing changes to the rule. Potential idea or variances to rule. One potential idea to relieve some of the restrictions on grazing landowners, just for consideration, might be developing a process where if an opted-in grazing landowner can demonstrate that they have been using their allocation on the grazing parcel, have been developing newly developed agriculture on that parcel, that there might be a process for them to reclassify their parcel as irrigated ag for purposes of the rule, and then freeing them up to some of the same benefits that irrigated lands get under the rule. Just wanted to raise that here as a potential variance process, or I think above that's appeals. It might be a concept for an appeal process, but the ability to reclassify a land use in front of the GSA as opposed to the county.
Kevin, could you re-describe the scenario you put out?
Yeah. So assume that a grazing landowner opts in for an allocation, and they're using the allocation to develop irrigated agriculture on that parcel. They're not using the water anywhere else, for example. Maybe there is a potential for a process that they can request from the GSA to reclassify that parcel from grazing land and reclassify it to irrigated agriculture, which if they can demonstrate they've been using water for that purpose, this could allow them to be treated on a more equal basis with landowners who have existing irrigated parcels. But that's just the idea that there might be potential for a process like that within these rules.
This focused on the APA. So right now, when you opt in, you only get sustainable yield. Are you focused on the landowner getting APA, getting the full classification for irrigated agriculture?
I think I know what you're asking, Kevin. If I can, you please answer Lou's question, and then I think I understand exactly what you're asking.
Whether it's sustainable, the sustainable yield native groundwater allocation or the APA allocation, I think that's a secondary question. I'm just more primarily focused on whether that process is possible, or if an opted-in grazing landowner will be permanently stuck under that classification in the future.
So to expand and maybe put a hypothetical with what and please correct me if I'm not interpreting this correctly, but for instance, I take grazing parcel, opted in, start growing on it. I potentially, with the limitation of some period of time to force it, I then can join it with another irrigated parcel, and that gives me more flexibility to use that allocation even from that other land on this new land, and vice versa. So I can create an allocation management account that is not just limited to that parcel. Conceptually, I know this has been discussed elsewhere in other basins. If maybe you farmed it for some period of time, so it isn't just, hey, I tried it for 1 year and now I automatically get to shift the allocation off. If maybe the growing is occurring on that property for a period of time, then maybe it can be allowed to join another AMA. Is that?
Yeah. Just to clarify a little further, on the other hand, existing irrigated parcels have the right under the rules, as I understand it, to share that allocation on any other parcel within the same zone. It doesn't have to be immediately connected to it. So I'm wondering if maybe there's, to help relieve some of these restrictions on grazing landowners, if they opt in, grazing landowner opts in for an allocation, can demonstrate they're using that groundwater on that parcel for irrigated agriculture. I'm wondering if there's potential for a process that allows them to later reclassify as irrigated lands and then enjoy the same rights as existing irrigated landowners who can use the allocation elsewhere in the same zone, not being so restricted to, immediately contiguous parcels.
Thank you for that. I understand the comment.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, input, whatever, I guess questions or comments?
I'll just echo what Gino said, just to beat my drum here. If irrigated grounds, Dave said, well, the reason is overdrafting to begin with.
Yeah.
And your comment was like, well, wait a second, it's overdrafting the fence line to fence line people, not the people that had contiguous ground and thoughtfully only planted some of them. Because if everybody did that, we would not be in this mess. So my request for the board is to keep that in mind. For the ones that have historical usage, for the ones that are contiguous, it's a departure from what he says. Because, for that reason.
Okay. Any raise?
And I don't think this is any kind of a big deal. And I hate to go back to opt-in grazing and stuff. But I just want to
1.7.2.
Oh, we're going there.
just quickly say, in our case, Stevenson has a lot of small parks. And there are defined grazing lands, 2 small parcels that are currently defined as grazing lands. But they're developed and they're gonna be in ag. Right now, as I read it, you have to have a contiguous irrigated ag land. But in the case of the next parcel away, it's contiguous only to the grazing land that is contiguous. So there's a parcel, there's a opt-in grazing land in between. Is that still covered here?
It is not. I spoke to Greg about that before. Sorry to cut him off, but I spoke to Greg about that before. It is not. That would also be my.
So it is, but not defined yet. I would turn everybody to page 30.
I did it again.
Oops.
No, it's fine. I'm just trying to show we're listening to you, Bob.
Yeah. I appreciate it.
111.1.2, towards the bottom of page 30.
Okay.
Coordinated agricultural well usage for multiple small acreage opt-in grazing parcels. So this is the intent where if you had a couple of 20s or a couple of 10s, you don't want to have a well on each one, maybe one well and those conserve and you can create some stacking. I think the question and what Lou is asking in some other situations is if I have a couple of 600-acre sections, can I stack all of those in some way? That starts to get, that's not what this is intended to do. This was intended to address the issue you've raised out in Stevenson with small lots and the inefficiency of a well on each one.
Especially with red line and non-red line are different things.
Well, appreciate that, Gene.
Thank you.
Okay. Any
Other-
raised hands online?
Not at this time.
No raised hands online. Any other questions or comments in the room or online?
Eric, is this your last meeting?
That last one.
Is Eric still on?
Well, August 31st, I thought was his.
This is not his last meeting.
I bet a beer on that. He'll be around.
I know, he likes you, Brad. All the time he goes, is Brad gonna be there?
I want to talk to
He is not
All right,
online.
Don't
so
hold your breath.
you need to adjourn then if we're officially, if there's no more comments, then we leave it to
Adjourn.
you to adjourn.
Okay, meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Let me know when the online is dead.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.